Okay, we'll start now. Hello everyone, Happy New Year to you all. I hope you're all keeping well wherever you're joining us from today. A big thank you for joining. We've had a record number of registrations for this webinar, which is a fantastic way to start off the year. Today we are joined by Sukraj, Dhruv and John. If you've seen any of our previous webinars, I'm sure you'll be quite familiar with all of them. We will be discussing our Stoic New Year's resolutions for 2021. Feel free to type any questions or comments or share any of your New Year's resolutions through the Q&A tool or the chat function on your Zoom toolbar, and we'll try to cover as many as we can. We won't be using the raise hand function today. Please also check out our social channels. We're on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube. So please get following us and look out for any foundation news and upcoming events or webinars. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion, and I'll now hand over to Justin, the founder of the foundation.
Thank you, Holly. Good afternoon in most circumstances here in Europe, and good morning in other parts of the world. Dhruv is actually calling in from New Zealand, which we greatly appreciate. And we've got quite a few people joining us in the United States. So welcome everyone, and best wishes from the foundation and the team here for 2021. Needless to say, 2020 was an unusual year for all of us. It was an enormous amount of unexpected disruption. But quite interestingly, Stoicism had a real comeback, if you will, or a move forward, or a lot of people seemed to come across it for the first time for various reasons. And that being because it was such a black swan event with the pandemic. People were looking for different sources of resilience, different sources of thinking about how things can be so disrupted and how to work through it, and what values and perspectives they wanted or needed or had to realign to get through it in different ways. Perhaps one of the things that came out, certainly for many people, was the acute shortness of time. We had more time on our hands in some ways, depending if you were furloughed or you're working from home or your commute circumstances changed. So that was one perspective that, from a Stoic perspective, the value of time certainly came under a certain amount of scrutiny last year as well. So here we are in 2021, and I'd like to read this quote from Marcus that we put on the foundation social sites before the end of the year. Let us prepare our minds as if we come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day. The one who puts the finishing touches on their life each day is never short of time. And as we begin a new year, it's a wonderful opportunity to think about time and how we're going to plan 2021 after a very indifferent 2020 in terms of the circumstances. I'll talk more about in a few moments when we get to the end of the webinar about the foundation and what's happened in the first year, and also some of the great things, the momentum that is building across multiple activities and initiatives within the foundation, which is very, very exciting and also very gratifying. Even though for most of the year we were shut down, we did have our first major event in London just before shutdown. We've done numerous webinars and virtual events. We've got more things coming through that medium, but we're also planning for the end of the pandemic and when we can get back together in different ways through different events and different initiatives. So we appreciate everything that people have dedicated themselves and followed the foundation with good faith throughout the year. So this afternoon, joined by Dhruv, John and Sukraj, really appreciate their dedication and their partnership within the foundation. Dhruv, as mentioned, is calling in from New Zealand this morning, which is greatly appreciated. Sukraj is locked down in London, and John is also locked down. We're all here in the UK. And so we look forward to sharing today's perspectives. So we'll move straight ahead. As mentioned, it's been a very interesting 2020. It has not been easy for a lot of people. people have had to work through different circumstances, both professionally, personally, from within their communities, within their families. And many of the mainstays and the main values and the main points in Stoicism have really been very, very important and very supportive for people as they have conducted themselves and worked through the difficult circumstances of 2020. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Sukraj, and we're going to start a conversation with this particular quote from Seneca. So welcome, Sukraj, and happy 2021 to you.
Thanks, Justin. And thanks to everyone for dialing in today. It's great to have you all here. I think I just wanted to add a couple of comments before we launch into the Stoic Sage and our evaluations, which I'm sure we all have lots and lots of thoughts on. And I think it's about our cautious evaluation of 2020. Today, our conversation is all about resolutions. It's all about how we feel about our resolutions. And I think when we evaluate the last 12 months, we need to consider how we're looking at things through a Stoic lens rather than through a social lens. So I think as we go through this discussion, certainly think about when we're evaluating the last 12 months around true values and goods in a Stoic sense, rather than the social milestones or perceived successes that we perhaps subscribe to in a social sense over the last 12 months that perhaps may not have materialized as we would have hoped, in the way that perhaps promotions, the dream holidays, dream weddings, whatever they might be, and really bring the focus onto personal growth and the power of our own judgment and our own views in our growth. And I think certainly in being part of this Stoic community in the last year or so, it certainly has lent to an exponential period of growth for myself. And I think it's really important to recognize, especially with the departure from the norm that we've had in the last year or so, about just really being cautious about how we're assessing ourselves and how far we've come with our resolutions. And I think the other thing to add to that, not to labour the point about the lockdown, and certainly with the increasing restrictions in London, is I know from conversations with my team, one of my paralegals mentioned today that she is exhausted with lockdown London and suffering from lockdown exhaustion. And I think there is a real opportunity here for us to reframe things in a Stoic sense, and really take an opportunity and say, actually, with the long-term challenge, we've really exercised our mental pathways and mental muscles in becoming more resilient over this extended lockdown, in the same way that a month's lockdown wouldn't have achieved the same result. But moving on, I think we're looking forward now to 2021 and the Stoic Sage. I think my view here, and I think we're all familiar with the principle of the Stoic Sage and the ultimate goal of living wisely as we walk our path through life. I think we can treat this particular quote as a really good chance to decide how we're going to evaluate our day one. So we can see it all up on screen. There is a need, in my view, for someone as a standard against which our characters can measure themselves. Without a ruler to do it against, you won't make the crooked straight. I won't labour the point, I'll let everyone chip in as well. But I recently read How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. It's one of the recommended books on the Foundation website, and it was a brilliant read. And one of the things the author, Donald Robinson, suggests are really good exercises to evaluate ourselves, to decide what are the desirable character traits that we want to work towards, who is the person we want to become. And I think when we're looking at resolutions, when we're starting and we're saying this is day one, this is where I want to go forward, it's an opportunity to really be brutally honest with ourselves, to look at the last 12 months of growth and say, have I done everything I could have done? Have I engaged in a strategy that I've really enacted, that I've really carried out? Has it been effective? Was it well planned? And really thinking about that going forward. And I think that's part of a discussion we'll come back onto when we're talking about how to work through our resolutions. But I think when we're thinking of the Stoic Sage, we know it's a big ask of anyone. Of anyone is human, it's a big ask. But I think we can engage in these kinds of exercises to look at ourselves and make a really honest evaluation of where we are at the beginning of the year, to then identify where we want to go in the next 12 months. But with that, I'll invite Dhruv and John with their thoughts as well.
Thanks, Sukraj, for the opening comments, and Justin for the kind words as well, and the opportunity to be here. And thank you everyone for joining in. The reflection that Sukraj mentioned on looking at your own character and thinking about where you can improve is, I think, quite a difficult one, and also quite, I'm not sure if the word brutal was mentioned earlier, but there is an alternative for those who aren't maybe as familiar with the Stoic principles, or maybe just don't know where to start. So I was certainly in this position around this time last year, where I'd come out of a Buddhist monastery, spending 2 weeks over Christmas and New Year's there. And I was feeling really good about life. And I just decided, well, one thing that I want to do is continue meditating, which that's thankfully happened. And the other thing I want to do is think about how we can apply Stoicism more practically. So I was definitely reading a lot of texts and listening to podcasts and trying to do a daily practice on that, but I had never considered doing practical exercises. And so if anybody saw the Stoic Shot on Instagram, I have this, which is a book by Massimo Pigliucci and Gregory Lopez called Live Like a Stoic. It's also known as a handbook for new Stoics in a different publisher. And that has week by week exercises. So 52 exercises that you can do to apply Stoic principles, broken down into 3 sections on the, let's see, discipline of desire. Oh, there we go. Discipline of desire, discipline of action, and discipline of assent, I believe. Yes, I got them all right. And that's an easier way, in my opinion, or at least a more structured way to go about doing this reflection. So instead of thinking maybe over all of 2020 and thinking about all of 2021 in one go and thinking about this kind of bird's eye view, I was taking it week by week and just saying, okay, what's the exercise for this week? What's the exercise for this week? And I'm not going to pretend like I was perfect. Towards the end of the year, definitely, there were many weeks where I just wrote, oh, I think I should have paid more attention to this week. But that's a way of, in combination with something like journaling, meditation, measuring yourself against the straight ruler. Like you can use that as regular checks, like journaling and meditation, along with this exercise, to keep up this reflection, not just at the start of the year, but throughout the year. And if John has any other comments, we welcome right now.
Yes, thank you. So, I mean, I have a couple of thoughts on this passage. So, obviously, its main focus is on the importance of role models, right? You need to find a virtuous role model. You need to find those figures or characters that you that offer a standard that you find admirable, that you would like to work towards. And I mean, a quick comment on the second part of the passage. I mean, so Seneca says, without a ruler to do it against, you won't make the crooked straight, right? That sounds on the face of it like a nice little bit of rhetoric. There's actually some quite complex Stoic philosophy behind this. So the Stoics think that there are 2 different types of qualities to things. Some are variable, right? Something can be hot or cold, and you can vary that across a continuum. There are other qualities that can't be varied, and one of those is straightness. A stick is either straight or it's bent. There are no degrees of straightness, right? And the Stoics think that virtue is like that. Virtue is an all or nothing affair, right? Either someone's virtuous or they're not. There are no degrees. And so Seneca's making a very specific reference to the Stoic sage there when he's talking about getting straight. What I mean, a reader well versed in the details of Stoicism will immediately see that as a reference to becoming fully virtuous. So that's just something I wanted to pick up there. That is a sort of thing that many people might not immediately notice. To become straight here means to become virtuous, and that's what he's telling us. So that's the sense in which the virtuous role model will help to make us straight, right? So that was one thing I wanted to say. And another thing that really struck me about this is contrasting it with some things that Epictetus has to say. So Epictetus talks a lot about habituation, right? And if we're talking about New Year's resolutions, we're thinking about habituation, how to develop good new habits, how to get rid of existing bad habits. And one of the things that Epictetus says is, if you want to develop new habits, you need to pay close attention to the sorts of people that you hang out with. And a virtuous role model might be someone really good to spend time with, that you can emulate. But it's equally important to avoid people that have bad habits. It's equally important to avoid people that might share the bad habits that you have that you're trying to escape. Because if you spend time with them, inevitably they're going to influence you, and their bad habits are going to reinforce your bad habits. So Epictetus says, if you really want to break free of a bad habit and start to develop a new one, as someone might think they're trying to do in a New Year's resolution, that might involve rethinking some of your social interactions, right? Who do you want to avoid, right? If someone's trying to cut down on their drink, the last thing you want to do is regularly be going to the pub with your old drinking mates and say, well, I'll just have a little bit less this time. Epictetus is going to say, no, your character is too fragile for that. You're going to have a clean break if you really want to make any progress in changing that habit. And that would apply to all of the kind of changes in our characters that we might want to try to undertake.
I was going to, just before we go to the next slide, just touch on everyone and just fill in a couple of points there. And I think it was very well said from everyone. Is one of the interesting things is recently we ran a Stoic Wellness Week at a company here in London. And over the period of that week, and the audience came in contact with the Stoic concept of living a virtuous life. And that's the most important thing as a Stoic that you would do, irregardless of circumstances. When it's good, you're still trying to live a virtuous life. When it's bad and difficult and life is turned on its head, it's still the goal to live a virtuous life. So therefore, day-to-day conflict, day-to-day difficulties, day-to-day challenges are reduced significantly in terms of what I'm doing to get through the day, because I have one overriding goal always. And I think the pandemic has caused people to reflect deeply about their purpose and what happens, because I have seen people that have had significant careers completely upended, where they're not only the career is over, they've been made completely redundant, and everything was absolutely fine prior to the pandemic. But some people have had to stress on that significantly. But I have seen a number of people who live Stoic lives who have been upended like that maintain themselves with remarkable resilience, because the job and everything is extremely important. No one's discounting that. But because they live at a higher goal set of their honor, their integrity, living with virtue, they've seemed to have weathered the storm so much better with a different set of focus. And I would absolutely re-emphasize again, some of the things that Dhruv mentioned around, and John mentioned around habits. When the going gets difficult, it's an old saying, is that when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And how do you remain tough, or how do you remain resilient? Well, you need habits. If you've got the right habits, the right rituals, and you're repeating them day after day, again, when it's good or when it's not so good, the habits are the same. And it's providing you a very unique set of skills to ride through difficult circumstances. And I think Seneca in this quote, he makes no bones. And I agree, John. I think it's an excellent selection by Sucras, this quote, because Seneca makes no bones here. a line or a ruler is straight, and therefore the goal is unequivocally clear, the requirement. So I think that that really sets out that Stoic sage, and whether it's good or bad or indifferent or things about, there is your focus, and you are relentless on that focus as a Stoic. Whether you're meeting up to it every day is a different matter, but the focus never really changes. Moving on then, what is a good resolution? Sukraj, let's start with you.
Thanks, Justin. I think my view here, when we thought about what we wanted to talk about today, is breaking down resolutions and looking at things in a much wider view, a view from above, so to speak. And I think that's because when we look at life as a celebration, or where we look at life and it's the relative time that we have, it's not a long time. And I think when we look at resolutions day to day or year to year, we sometimes can be hampered by the fact that that is a very, very short amount of time. But when we're looking at life in a much broader sense, in the long term, where do I want to be in 20 years, or what kind of person do I want to be in 20, 30 years time? I think we encourage ourselves to look at what our goals should be. And I think one of the themes that has become apparent to me, and I'm exploring in my Stoic reading, is around the idea of balance. This balance that we have when we're looking at ourselves internally, when we turn out externally to interacting with our wider world and our wider community, how we're balancing our emotions, how we think about how we react to situations, acceptance versus action. And I think that's really important. And when we're looking at our resolutions in the round, I think that's where we need to consider, take a step back and look at the next year or however long it is, and think about, are my resolutions balanced? Are they all focused just on myself? Are they all focused in one particular area of my character? What does that look like for me? And I think it's important to take that broad view about where you want to go and what your higher goals are. And I think on that point, when we're moving on from the Stoic sage, I think for every Stoic, we start with looking at ourselves. It all starts internally, and then we move on from there. But one of the points that I really think about is the greater good, and what that really means for all of us. What that means in terms of a resolution, how that breaks down into our everyday, and what we can actually do. And I think at the moment, for me, my interpretation is we can all engage in the greater good. We can all do it, and we can all make that part of our resolution. And it doesn't have to necessarily be huge. We don't always have the capacity, the resource, or the opportunity to be involved in something that we think will influence the global greater good. But I think small acts of kindness are just as powerful. They cause a ripple effect. And I think that's something we need to consider in the round when we're looking at our resolutions. And one of the points that I was talking about earlier this week, and especially in the context of the pandemic and the greater good, and encouraging my team to get involved in more CSR activity, is during the pandemic, we may need to become a little bit more innovative about how we're contributing to the greater good, how we're engaging with the people around us, especially in times of lockdown, where we may find it's much easier to be away from people, and perhaps it's harder to find opportunities. And I think that's something that we really need to think about as Stoics, to make sure it's on our agenda. I think the other point around balancing resolutions and looking at these things in the round is a point that's made quite often in Stoicism, is that life moves on very, very quickly. We're not the same people we were yesterday versus even a year ago. Life just keeps flowing. And I think that comes down to us all, even though we're making a resolution at the beginning of the year, we need to be very conscious of that flow of time, of the flow of that river, in the sense that our resolutions may not become fit for purpose as our resolutions change or our goals change, or as we change and we actually, maybe we've really improved on something and the resolution that we've made should actually be altered and adjusted during the year. And I think Stoic practice encourages us to do this when we're thinking about this every day, and we're maintaining that awareness all the time of when we're looking at our resolutions and where we need to change direction as Stoics and working for the greater good. Dhruv, John, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks for your comments about balancing and adapting with the resolution. To add to that, I think I just want to focus on each of the internal, external, and give some examples to make it a little bit more concrete for those who are watching. We're constantly misled by maybe just how we're raised or our minds evolutionarily about things which will make us happy. Things like money, promotions, a chiseled body. Whereas these are external indifference, and the science shows that you get them, you get a little bit happy, but then your baseline happiness returns very quickly. And we could do a lot better just by focusing internally on things which we know do make us happy. Gratitude, mindfulness, exercise for the sake of well-being and being healthy, as opposed to the perfect body. So when we look at internal resolutions, I think of things like character. Are you working on your anger? Are you working on kindness? I think about external things. I think about habits. What are the habits that you've set yourself up for? As John and Justin mentioned earlier, trying to create the environment, trying to create the space where you're avoiding temptation, which I'll definitely get to in the next point on the next question. And then greater good things. I think once you have the internal and habits kind of locked down and fairly stable, at that point, I would recommend going to think about the greater good. Just because in my experience, if you take that on too early, it's a difficult task. And thinking about other people when you yourself aren't secure or stable can be quite overwhelming. But if anybody in the audience is at that point, I would start thinking about volunteering, things like effective altruism, climate change, animal rights, anything where you are contributing to the wellness of people outside of your immediate circle of concern. I think these are the good resolutions that we should aim for. If one of my friends runs a cafe, aiming for doubling profits in the first 2 years or first 3 years or within the next however many months, not a great idea. Aiming to be a good boss and managing the employees well and taking on challenges like the pandemic, that's a good resolution. If you're working professionally, aiming for a certain amount of bonus, not a particularly good idea. But aiming for doing good work, being less distracted, focusing, prioritizing based on what your managers want. So these are things that are within your control, and they tend to lead to better outcomes, but they shouldn't be done for that reason. There's two things about Epictetus that I come to mind. One is considering the whole action before you start. And I think this one's important. Consider the failure case. Don't be disheartened by it, but at least consider what happens if you quote unquote fail in your resolution, right? And if it's something within your control, and this is the second point about Epictetus, can't remember the quote exactly, but the paraphrase is, well, if you choose to only take part in activities where you have complete control, you are invincible, right? And so if you do fall off the wagon, you can just get back on it. Whereas if you aim something externally, you tie your well-being and your happiness and this resolution that you've made on a fresh start and your idea of yourself to something external, which could fail. And that can be quite disheartening. Whereas if you take it on something within your control, regardless of whether it applies in this internal, external, or greater good category, still within your control, that's setting you up for success and well-being and happiness. And at the end of the day, it's what we're here for. John, do you have anything more to add to that?
Yeah, sure. That was great. I mean, a couple of thoughts that I think connect with what you've both just said. So to pick up on that idea of habituation, and also what Sukraj was saying earlier about the fact that we're quite changeable. Again, a thought from Epictetus. He says, if you want to develop a new habit, whatever the goal might be, the way to do it is just start, right? Just start with that right kind of action. So as you were saying about, say, effective altruism, if you want to do it, just go and volunteer, just do it once, right? The positive thing that he says is that as soon as you start doing it, each time you do it, it will contribute to developing that positive habit. They'll develop something like a virtuous circle, right? So you can take very small steps at the beginning, but they'll very quickly contribute to developing a positive habit that will strengthen and strengthen each time you do it. So there's a kind of an optimistic note there that if you just get on and try and do whatever it is you want to for your new resolution, just taking that first step will actually be really important. The flip side, of course, of that is that every time you don't manage to do it, that's going to contribute to a vicious circle, and you can very quickly get out of the habit. So he suggests that we need to be quite vigilant about the sorts of actions that we do. Every action we make, either good or bad, will contribute to the kind of corresponding habit. So that's something that we need to sort of bear in mind and sort of pay close attention to the decisions that we're making. Every little action will contribute to the character that we're developing over time.
I think all three are very strong statements around progressive Stoic thought and actions. My follow-on to all of that would be as follows. I think for me personally, when Stoicism really took hold, and I always consider myself an aspiring Stoic. You never get to the sage end result, so to speak. But it's very interesting with Tim LeBon and the great work that Tim does in terms of the assessments. And we've got some of that coming onto the foundation soon, which I'll reference at another date. But there is ability to, with the work that Tim done and through modern Stoicism, to take surveys and know where you are in some sort of data point as a Stoic. And that's quite interesting for those who like to have a starting reference point and where you can go. So that's point one. So that's just an interesting thing to be aware of, and we want to offer that through the foundation soon enough. Second of all, I myself never do New Year's resolutions. I just don't do them. Haven't done a New Year's Eve event for a long time and don't do New Year's resolutions because of the following. I've already committed to myself to live with Stoic aspirations. That requires a certain commitment to character and virtue. Those are the resolutions. So they are there every day. I don't have to reset them on December the 31st or going into an event. They are there. And the third thing I would add to that, which is a really interesting thing and a part of life, I think, when you get to a certain understanding within Stoic awareness is, and it was touched on, and Drew touched on it here about, we live in a society, particularly in the West, that is heavily focused on materialism, heavily focused on career gain, heavily focused on money, heavily focused on all those things. Now, under no circumstances am I suggesting that you don't have goals or these things, or you want to get on in life and you want to do those things. That creates purpose, that creates direction. It allows your energy to go in positive directions. However, if you're overriding that at the very top and your pursuit of refining and developing a virtuous and great character, the great thing about that Stoic primary goal, it takes the pressure off life. In a bizarre, almost contrasting view, if your number one focus is character and virtue and trying to get there and the journey to get there under any circumstances, if that's first, all the other things that you're trying to do, get on in my career, get on financially, material gain, get on with my peers, all these different things, they come in a nice dovetail underneath the top goal, if you will, and the pressure is taken off. that journey to gain, because you're working on something in a higher level, which is the third point here, the greater good. You are tied to yourself within a greater good resolution, and hopefully your impact on the world and others, living a virtuous life of character, rises above other goals and other resolutions, which tend to often cause anxiety, stress, worry. And those can be minimized if, in the Stoic sense, you are resolutely focused on character and virtue. And I think it's a very interesting point that John mentions, whether it's Seneca or particularly when you read Marcus. He was, and I'll reference Marcus for a start, definitely a creature of habit. He seems to just, reading between book after book, his thoughts, his resolution, it seemed like he was a very disciplined person, and repeating his thought process, his check and balance. And even I'm in the middle of reading at the moment, The Five Great Emperors, and I keep coming back to them often. It's very interesting in that period, after Marcus, Commodus was a terrible decision, but prior to that, but you look at Trajan, you look at Hadrian, you look at these guys, you can tell they were very disciplined individuals. They repeated their habits. Not to say that they were Stoics like Marcus, I'm not suggesting that. But Marcus, as a Roman emperor, with such unbridled access and power, was a very disciplined human being. You can read it between the lines. And I think that helps develop internal and external resolutions on a daily basis that become almost part of your DNA. Right, next then, let's go on to our third topic, or third theme here, is how do we carry out suitable resolutions? And let's start with Sucrose.
Thanks, Justin. So I think one of the key things we did here is to think about what is a resolution. And in its essence, it really is, it starts with intention. So we Googled the definition, and it's a firm decision to here.
Cool.
Sorry about that. Can you all hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
sorry, because that was my accident. Sorry.
So it's intentional in nature. And we'll come on to the quote in just a minute. I think it's got lots of different elements there as well. And I think we'll, mindful of the time that we've got, I think there's lots of things that we want to touch on there. I think I want to focus on this slide is the state of mind when it comes to your intention. One of my very favorite quotes from meditations is souls are dyed by thoughts. And I think this is one of the points that tennis superstar Pat Cash touched on in his webinar as well, is your thoughts do turn into actions. So when it comes to our state of mind in regards to a resolution, whether it's a New Year's resolution or to Justin's point about a resolution as a Stoic, it needs to be robust, and we need to remind ourselves and reiterate that resolution to ourselves. And I think in combination with that, what's come up consistently is the idea of habits and consistency. And there is a quote that I think of fairly often is, to live a life of virtue, you have to become consistent, even if it isn't convenient, comfortable, or easy. And I think that's the thing with Stoic behaviors. It's with goals in general, with resolutions, is it's not easy all the time. And especially when it's a departure from the norm, when you're having to break a routine or say no to things in order to say yes to new habits for your resolutions. It's really about thinking, if my state of mind is robust enough and I've got this intention to make sure that I'm controlling all that I can control in relation to driving this intention towards my goals, it may be uncomfortable, it may require adjustment, but the more I exercise those mental pathways, the more I kind of keep backing myself up and saying, I'm going to do this, and reiterating that to ourselves, we become stronger in our intentions and more able to carry them through. John, Drew, do you have any additional thoughts?
I'll try and keep this brief, but if anybody wants to dig deeper onto what I'm about to say, there's a slide on the recommended resources and a couple of slides on the Happiness Lab podcast. And I've recommended 3 episodes, which are very good for New Year's resolutions and habit formation. And I'll just summarize what those podcasts say, because they're just, not only are they very practical and, once you think about them, very logical, but they tie in extremely well with what the Stoics were very insightful on, which is habit formation. So we've thrown out around the word habit a lot, but habits, as defined by Wendy Wood, author of Good Habits, Bad Habits, is a reward or a perception of a reward, a routine, and a context. So if you have those 3 things, you can form a habit. And if you're trying to break a habit, you need to remove one of those 3 things. So, for example, John mentioned earlier with the drinking with the mates at the pub, that is a context. And if you remove that context, you are going to break that habit of maybe drinking too much. And what a habit does is it takes temptation out of the equation. 2 of the 4 cardinal virtues for Stoicism are wisdom and temperance. Well, exercising temperance becomes a lot easier if you're smart about it, instead of just using willpower by sheer force. But you will, at some point, fail or fall off the wagon. Like, I had days where I was not meditating. I had days where I was not paying attention to my Stoic exercises. And I think the key thing to remember is not to be harsh on yourself when that happens. And this might sound a little bit counterintuitive. How do you intend strongly and keep yourself to a high standard without being harsh on yourself? And I guess the thing to realize is, the thing about habit is you want to make it easy to return to. So if you're harsh on yourself, it's like, oh, how did you fall off? How could you do this? How are you talking to yourself in this really demeaning manner? You wouldn't take it from a friend. You wouldn't take it from, you wouldn't give that to a child. So why would you do that to yourself? And I think Kristen Neff in one of the podcasts says, well, you need 2 things for that. You need self-compassion and awareness. Well, awareness is when you've fallen off. And this is something that Seneca says, you have to be logical, be a fair judge to yourself, but mitigate the punishments. I have a quote for that, but I can give the references if anybody needs it. But also in being a friend to yourself. And this ties into the self-compassion, which comes in 2 forms. It comes in fierce self-compassion, saying, come on, I know you can do better. You've got to step up. And tender compassion, self-compassion, which is saying, well, it's all right. You are fallible. You are not a Stoic sage. You are human. So when you're struggling to form that habit, when you're still in the early days, or if you're doing well and you have a slip up, it's just about, well, okay, that week of Stoic exercises didn't go well for me, or that week, but next week, try again. And I would emphasize or kind of encourage people just to be smart, be kind when executing, because that's what's going to keep you going in the long run. That's sustainable. Whereas being harsh on yourself, and I know it might sound like, or it might seem like Stoics are quite, we hold ourselves to a high standard, but we don't self-flagellate to get there, right? That's not useful, and it's not implied by the philosophy either. But yeah, if Justin or John have any additional thoughts, that'd be great.
Yes, that was very interesting, Drew. I think I mean, there are a number of points I think I'd like to pick up from what you were saying. So, I mean, I think the concept we find in Epictetus of people making progress is quite useful here, right? We're all making progress. We're all working towards an ideal. And the way in which the Stoics present the sage as this kind of perfect individual might seem quite daunting, but it's also worth stressing that they don't realistically expect many people to reach that ideal. The rest of us are all fallible and imperfect, and we're doing our best. We're all making progress. We're all at different stages of the journey. So absolutely, we ought to be kind to ourselves when we slip up occasionally, because inevitably we're going to, because we're imperfect. I think the flip side of that, which Marcus Aurelius stresses quite often, is we should be equally kind and gentle to other people when they slip up too, right? They're going to slip off the wagon from time to time as well. And by acknowledging that they're imperfect means that we can be kinder and gentler to them. And so reminding ourselves of other people's fallibility, there's a sense in which that will contribute to us developing our own virtues, right? The more we bear in mind that other people are just human and will make mistakes, the more likely we're going to act with generosity and kindness towards them. And that in itself is going to help to make us better people and to develop those good social habits and virtues. But I'll stop there and pass over to Justin.
Look, excellent from everyone there. I think the thing or the point that comes to mind, two things actually. If you want, and we've talked about this a little bit before, but if you want to be a great tennis player, you go get a tennis coach and you put in the time. If you want to get a great sculpted body, you mentioned Drew, you go to the gym every day. If you want to learn to have any skill, you have to go to that environment and apply time, energy, and understanding. If you want to have a great character, live a life of virtue, and find that sense of peace and harmony and strength of confidence of character, you have to do the time. You have to do the work, just like if you were learning to play tennis or any other decided discipline. The fact that for some reason we think you, as human beings within this society, you just wake up and you're naturally going to be happy every day. That does happen. Some days you just feel better and you feel happy for whatever reason. And a lot of days you don't, for whatever reason. So it's the days that you don't, that you go into the gym of Stoicism, and you're creating that habit and these mind principles and values of behavior and thought processes. And I would just summarize this point from my perspective with Marcus when he says, the mind is stained with the color of its thoughts. So if you can continually repeat the thoughts and the behaviors, but you have to work at it in a process, but the mind does become stained, and therefore the outcomes from the color of your mind, become, self-evident. So, an excellent point. We're just about at closure time, so we're just going to have a little bit of administration after we close up here, and a couple of things we want to take away. But to close, and some key takeaways, Sucrose, please.
Great. So I think thanks to Drew for putting these together expertly, as always. I think the top level here is really focusing internally, to focus on your character and being pro-social. Expect realistically, start small and build up steadily, and aim for overall consistency, not consecutive days. And I think that really adds on to Drew's point about being kind to yourself, and being realistic about habits may not always be consistent every single day, but being kind and seeing that growth over time, and intending strongly. And we can choose to persevere, even to readjust, but not the pace of progress or end result. And I think that comes down to when we're talking about state of mind earlier, we need to focus on our intentions at the outset and make them as robust as possible. Back to you, Justin.
Oh, thank you, Sucrose. Drew, with a comment here or two in closing out, and then from John as well.
No, that was beautifully done by Sucrose. I have nothing to add to that.
John, thank you. John?
No, again, I think that was a great summary. Sucrose caught that just right. So yeah, I just we want to stress what she said.
Terrific. So thanks to everyone of our three panelists today for their contribution putting us together. I think there's some tremendous takeaways here, and also the content that was delivered before. Some recommended resources. Comment here from the panel.
Oh, this was a short piece I wrote last New Year about New Year's resolutions that people can find online that they might find interesting.
Terrific. And then Drew did mention this, the lab Happiness, A New Hope, Kicking Bad Habits, and Dump Your Inner Drill Sergeant. Drew.
Yeah. So these are 3 episodes Thank you, Justin. These are 3 episodes of the Happiness Lab podcast, which I recommend for anyone who wants to take a deeper dive into the science of the psychology behind New Year's resolutions and habit forming. Remember, one of the key principles of Stoicism, apart from ethics, is physics as well as logic. And physics in the modern sense means a good understanding of science. And in this case, a good understanding of science requires a good understanding of psychology, and specifically the psychology of New Year's resolutions, habits, and self-compassion. And those are really excellent resources. And if you listen to those, you'll realize that I have said nothing that is particularly new or insightful.
You'll be a bit harsh on yourself. Well, great. Needless to say, the content of the webinar will be available on the website, and we'll post some different things across social media as well. Thanks again, everyone. Just a couple of things to close out from an administration standpoint. Apologies, we're about 5 minutes over time. But the foundation, we want to thank you for a first year, a great year. We couldn't be more pleased with the momentum we're building, and we're doing it very carefully, very measured, very organically, and the momentum certainly building across various initiatives, not only here in the UK, but across the world as well. And we're looking to build on those collaborations. We have a fantastic collaboration building with the Young Presidents Organization, a very powerful business organization, an influential group that we're building a virtual program this year and potentially an event later in the year. John and I are kicking off that first webinar on February the 11th, and we're very excited about that. One of the things which I'll talk about in a moment, we've launched through the foundation a wellness week, a Stoic journey for calmness and awareness that we've recently launched. We've had one wellness week with one company here in London that I'm involved with, and that has gone extremely well. It was very interesting what happened during that week, and I'll talk more about that just very quickly in a moment. We're delighted to add Eve Riches to our team here at the foundation. Eve did a wonderful webinar with us late last year, and she's joining the team, and she's developing an online Stoic course, which will be added to the foundation in the next month or so, or maybe a little bit longer. The whole foundation team will be working with Eve to round that course out. We're still keen to do the event for the Aurelius Foundation later in the year. We're obviously just waiting to see when global restrictions will be lifted, and we'll look to start planning that accordingly. And then John mentioned tonight, before we came on to this webinar, it's Marcus's 1900th birthday this year. He was born in 121 AD on the 26th of April, and the foundation is looking to partner with Modern Stoicism with John, Donald Robertson, and Christopher Gill and others on supporting that birthday event, which will be a lot of fun and very interesting for us all. You will see soon, in closing, the Aurelius Foundation Virtual Stoic Weakness Program. It's virtual at the moment. The outline of that program will go up on the site soon. We have, after the first week, we have 5 other companies here in London who want to do that week, and we're very privileged to offer that out soon. We're refining the program from what we did in this first one, which was very interesting. It was a lot of fun. The details, we do 5 days of virtual engagement from the Stoic experts with the foundation and other business leaders, interactive video content, live webinars, daily exercises, engaging in data-driven surveys so that you can measure yourself and where you sit within your peer group. And we've had a lot of colleague engagement on that, and we're very pleased with the results that our good friend Tim LeBond was able to quantify during that week, how people felt at the start, how they felt at the end, and what they gained. I want to thank John for all his hard work and his contributions on that, and it was a very enjoyable week as well. So we look forward to building on that for the future, and the word is already getting out there. It's a great investment in not only Stoic thought and philosophy, but it's a great investment in wellness programs within any company. And here's some of the things and the outline of that program and how we approached it. And we can tailor it in any particular way, as mentioned. And it's a great avenue for an access to Stoicism, but also for mental wellness and good well-being overall. So the foundation is looking to push that program as we go forward here. Okay, much apologies. We're almost 9 minutes over. Thank you to the panels The panelists today, Sukraj, Dhruv, and John, as always, greatly appreciated for everyone pulling this together. Sukraj and Dhruv, you drove this one. It was excellent content on every level. I hope everyone took a lot out of it. Very excited about 2021. Things will change. The tide is turning. The tailwind of the vaccine hopefully is going to be with us soon, and things will start to normalize to some degree in the next months, but we're certainly in lockdown for the foreseeable future. On that note, Holly, is there anything else that we would close off? And if not, we will say thank you to everyone and look forward to seeing you soon on another webinar. But anything else, Holly?
No, that's all. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks everyone. Have a great evening or great day and look forward to seeing you soon.